Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of our Advocacy Cafe chats for Advocacy Month 2022. So excited to have you all joining us today. I hope you had a chance to join us for our first conversation last week about storytelling, which was fantastic. This week, we're going to be digging into legislative strategy. So if you haven't heard about the Advocacy Cafe chats, this is a new feature this year. At the recap, it's a recap of the end of every week, hosted by our panel of 3 incredible advocates coming from different chronic disease communities, and each one of their unique backgrounds and talents helps inform the conversation. First, we have Sarah Ramey, a musician and writer who has been featured in the Paris Review, NPR, and too many others to name. She received an MFA in creative nonfiction writing from Columbia University and was a writer for President Obama's 2008 campaign. Sarah has been living with pain and chronic illness for 17 years and has authored her first book, which has been called a darkly funny memoir entitled The Lady's Handbook for Her Mysterious Illness. Welcome, Sarah. Next, we have Cynthia Adinig, a marketing specialist and equity policy advisor. She sits on the board of Ramey and is a person with long COVID and as a self-described policy nerd, which we love. She has spent over a decade engaged in community service, focused on low-income communities of color, and uses her knowledge to advocate for both MECFS and long COVID communities. She has been an incredible high-profile advocate for our community. You may have seen her at international conferences or Time magazine speaking on our behalf. So from all of us, thank you so much for joining us and welcome Cynthia Adinig. Our third panelist, the lovely Sarah Tompkins, unfortunately can't make it today, but we'll see her again next week. Today, as I mentioned, we're digging into legislative strategy, and we have a special guest for you all who our lovely panel will be interviewing. It's my pleasure to introduce our partners at Thorn Run, Stuart Chapman. He's here to help us get a better idea about how the overarching policy environment and the legislative landscape impacts our advocacy efforts. Stuart is a former chief of staff and for both a congressional Blue Dog and a New Democrat, and he's not only overseen several moderate Democratic offices, but also boasts a great reputation for bringing together people from both sides of the aisle. Stuart, it's been a pleasure working with you these past couple of years, and thank you so much for joining us today. So thank you. Without further ado, let's hear from our advocates and let's hear from Stuart. Take it away, folks.
I definitely have a strategy question. I definitely have a few strategy questions. So my question for you, because we talked about before the issues with getting insurance legislation involved to help things such as coverage for important things that we like to try, important therapies that are not covered by insurance, like alternative therapies that people like me, who's not tolerant to a lot of supplements because of my severe MCAS, can't do, but we still need access to that, so we end up having to come out of pocket. So my question for you is, what do you think is a better way to approach the issue, the big issue of trying to draft insurance regulations into legislation? Would it be better to push for the People Act, HR 1, which is passed in the House 4 times and this sits in the Senate because of our razor thin margins? Or would it be better to try to push for some sort of other measures separately and focus more on getting more people elected that have that as their passion project to try to get garner more things on there? Or even if one more, and the other potential outcome I see also is, would it be better to try to reframe the concept of these regulations in a different way that would get more of our Republican members of Congress on board with any kind of that legislation?
Well, Cynthia, I love it how you start with a softball question right out of the bat. That makes it easy. Thank you very much, and I appreciate being here. And we thoroughly enjoy and have enjoyed working with Solve MECFS over the approaching 4 years now. We have, I admire Emily and Jesse and their efforts on the Hill. Our job is to supplement the efforts that they're doing. Emily has worked in DC, obviously, has an unbelievable instincts, knows how to sort of move the needle, and as importantly, knows how to incorporate so many patients in MECFS world in a way that is advantageous and that many of you know firsthand. So, on your question, Cynthia, I think, Congress moves slowly, right? And one of the things, as we were on a call this week with one of our champions, our long COVID champions, Congressman Beyer, and he and his staff were saying, hey, whatever you can do, there's a lot of blocking and tackling involved. We need to build up support for our bill and these bills and these efforts. And one of the things, as we've worked with MECFS with Solve over the last few years, is that we've had the opportunity to see Emily spearhead this effort around broadening the number of champions and the strengthening and expanding of those champions. When we started with you, working with you a few years ago, I would say on one hand, we could count the number of champions we could really go to. Now we're in a position where we are double, if not triple that number. I'm talking about people who will lay down the tracks, people like Don Beyer, who's introduced the long COVID bill. So, one of the things I think the answer to your question, and I'm not dodging it, but is a both and, right? We need to sort of do everything. We need to push and shape and craft the efforts that are being made out there, as Emily and Jesse have done throughout this Congress, so that, they are weighing in with those bill writers as they're working on it. Around the insurance issues that you're talking about, they're tricky. They are heavily reimbursement issues. They're sort of in the weeds. They're not exactly statutory, right? And so, what I've seen, I think the answer is not necessarily to worry about the vehicle. Is it HR 1? Is it HR 15? Is it Senate 4662? I think what I've seen with you, with all of you, is culminating in this massive, amazing, I mean, really, without question, you have a network and a ground game that I can't think of anyone else who does. And I think building up the momentum, building up those champions, you're seeing the culmination of it during this period, with these long COVID efforts. And I think it's been great. And so that's what I would say. Continue to have those champions you can go to, find those vehicles that they're working on, try to shape them to the best that we can, whether it's care centers, whether it's on the front on research, find if there are opportunities for us to worry about issues like insurance. And I think, as Emily's trying to broaden that reach to make sure that on the reimbursement side, as well as the statutory side, that we're doing more. So I think that is the answer. And I'm really impressed with the effort that all of those who are part of this effort this week and even next week are doing. Really pays dividends. And nothing, I will say that no members of Congress, when I used to work for members of Congress, and I know Sarah knows this world well, that, there were a couple of things that moved them, right? There are sort of gas prices, unfortunately, also sort of TV coverage of, big football games always seem to drive them, jobs in their district, and the actual stories that their constituents are telling them. And so when I get on the call with all of you, with members of Congress, and I hear those stories, and the members hear those stories, and the staff hear those stories, that they're powerful. And it changes the way that people view MECFS, view long COVID, and understand that we need to do more around these issues.
Thank you so much. It's nice to meet you. I'm Sarah.
Nice to meet you, Sarah.
I have just sort of like a larger question. I had a meeting this week with my representative that actually went shockingly well. She knew a lot about MECFS already, which was, one of a handful of times in my whole life that that's ever happened before. And I was wondering about your sense of being on some of these calls and being in the meetings, of how you see that this is, our advocacy is being received. And especially my specific question is about how the connection is being made between ME/CFS and long COVID, because I know a lot of people in my own life, they know me, they didn't know until like this week that those two things are so similar, if not the same. And so I was wondering how you're seeing all of this being received, and specifically if that link is being made in a way that you feel lands with the representatives when we're speaking to them.
That's a great question. Thanks for the question, Sarah. As you know, these meetings are eye-opening, right? When when members of Congress on the House side are representing 720,000 people, that may seem daunting, but it's also an opportunity. If all of us are having these meetings, that's an opportunity to break through. And for all of the noise and issues that are surrounding these members and those offices, that this genuinely is an opportunity. Sarah, I would agree with you. I think that's very well put. I think in some ways, long COVID during the pandemic has underscored that there is a relationship. And I think in some ways, I know some of the struggle that many of you, and I've heard your stories over many times, is about the lack of validation and the lack of appreciation. And in some ways, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, and it does seem to be the case, that there is now a newfound appreciation for ME/CFS precisely because of long COVID. So I think Emily will tell you, Jesse will tell you, when you talk to these offices, when you're talking about writing bills, there's a reason why, there's a reason, we were on the call with some administration officials the other day, and I think they were very appreciative of that sort of connection. I think these are well-trained sort of medical specialists for the most part, working at HHS and or the White House. I think though, for those offices, those congressional offices that aren't necessarily zeroed in on this issue, I think those new leaders that we have in Congress around long COVID, whether it's Senator Kane, whether it is Don Beyer, whether it is members who push for that 1.15 billion in NIH and research during the American Rescue Plan, I think they are making and have made that link. And I do think that in some ways, to use the word I used earlier, it does feel like validation for what I know for many of you has been a long, painful road, even for recognition.
Thank you.
I have another question unless there's something in the audience.
Oh, Cynthia, take it away.
It's not going to be an easy one. So Stuart, oh man, I love that I get to talk to you. Question about government agency structure. So we have, through this pandemic, seen some issues that comes with the structure of funding specific government agencies, and the issue with how policies are perceived by the directors that get put into those seats. So my question for you would be, and I think that I honestly think that at this point, the grand uniting thread between long COVID and ME/CFS right now is our displeasure in what's happening with NIH. So my question to you would be, would it be advantageous or even possible to consider creating a pitch, if you will, to restructure the funding of those agencies so that they are not reliant on the friendliness of whatever the current administration is, and more reliant on just following standard procedures that the rest of the world is doing that makes sense to science and technology and whatever else. Do you think that's a potential fix for the issues that we've been seeing these couple of years? Or would it just have to be, we would fight for legislation to make these things tighter?
On the funding, on the structuring of the funding?
Yes, so like I do believe NIH don't they get funded every year? Don't they rely on that funding every single year? And so when
Right.
when there's someone there to dangle that in front of them,
Mm.
then you see issues. At least from what I'm seeing from the outside in, I'm seeing that that is what has been happening, and our last person actually telegraphed that that was actually happening. So I was as again, I'm a problem solver, like kind of a person. So I'm always thinking of like, how can we fix this? And so one of the things that I thought about fixing this was to restructure it so that instead of doing it every year, give them a budget so that's to fund them for 4 years. That way you have a longer chance of creating a more streamlined, steadied approach to practical issues instead of that stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, instead of them kind of like trying to catch the pulse of whoever administration is in there and having to shift in ways that they were not prepared to, which slows down the progress. I see that happen at State Department too.
Yeah,
But yeah, most
I
government
know.
agencies.
I think that's a great question. And, I know we've had some limited exposure to state legislatures in the past, and they often have different sort of funding cycles. Unfortunately, at the federal level, and much of that NIH money, as you mentioned, is coming from appropriations. And I'll explain that in just a second. But we are on an annual basis. The government shuts down. If we're not able to be funded by the end of September, or our extensions run out, or whatever it is, in Congress, we have 12 appropriations bills. So we have sort of two sides of Congress. This is my Congressional 101 briefing, right? We have an authorizing committees. We have authorizing committees. So if you think about, for us, authorizing committees are often Energy and Commerce, or Senate Health, maybe Senate Finance, depending on some of the structure of the funding. And then once a bill passes, if one of our bills passes in House Energy and Commerce, for instance, ultimately there may be an authorization. You can slap any number you want on that, right? 10, 20 million. But then we have to go, and Emily actually does a great job of this. Then we have to go to appropriations, and we have to say, okay, your fellow committee, the committee that you connect with on the authorizing side, said we're owed 10 billion, or excuse me, 10 million, or 20 million, or 30 million. And you have to fight for the funding there. There was just for instance, there has been an ALS bill that's been passed in the last 6 months here that is supposed to provide $75 million in research. It was only funded when appropriations came around last year to the tune of 25 million. So, there is that sort of $50 million gap there. So to your point, Cynthia, about, the appropriation structure around here, we rely on that annual cycle. And it is just sort of so ingrained at this point that I think it would be really hard for us to provide that 4-year sort of gap. I mean, we do have authorizations that will run out that don't have to be funded annually. If we are in a situation where we're in sort of non-appropriation spending, discretionary spending, then you have a sort of broader latitude around that. So I think there's some general opportunities. I also think that the work that Emily and Jesse and Ovid and SolveME CFS has done over the last few years has been very appropriations heavy, as it should be, because the reality is there's only one thing in the Constitution that is required. Well, there are very few things that are required of Congress. One of them, as far as bills that must pass each year, and I think it's the only thing that it pertains to a bill, is that it has to, there's an annual appropriations bill. There's an annual funding bill. And that's what we rely on. It has to start in the House. Then we go through the whole process. And then it ultimately goes to the Senate and then, pass. But it takes a long time to do it. But that is the chief sort of funding mechanism for programs that come out of Congress.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have one additional question for you that just came up in the chat, and this is a question I've been asked a lot this week, so I wanted to highlight it because this is something that we've really struggled with in the last couple of years and this year as well. How do we get more Republican co-sponsors? A lot of patients are noticing that we have an overwhelming support of Democrats, and they're acknowledging that if we don't get Republicans, we'll likely die in committee. So how can we avoid committee death? And how can we call out to the Republican members of the specifically the House, but about the Senate as well, to sponsor these important bills?
Great question, Emily. I think look, it is a challenging time, and more. I've been in DC 21 years now, and it is more partisan now than it ever has been. And you would think that issues like solve MECFS, like MECFS, or like long COVID, they should be nonpartisan, bipartisan. You know, why is this happening like this? There are many in the party that we're talking about, and it wouldn't be dissimilar if the tables were flipped. But you know, who, when a Democratic bill is passed, are introduced, that they almost categorically refuse to join. And there are also, without question, and I say this as a moderate Democrat, that the Democrats are the party of healthcare, who are willing to spend money, to do the research, to go to extraordinary measures, and to use federal funding for those ends, to make sure that you know, healthcare is addressed. So what do we do about that? That doesn't change anything. And we're also moving toward a dynamic where we may have, you know, Republicans controlling all of Congress by the end of the year. So one thing that I think that y'all have done a very good job is helping these members find partners. I think we spent a lot of time, say, developing somebody like Jack Bergman from Michigan. I think that's important. Senator Hoeven from the Dakotas on the Senate side, an appropriator, has also been a very good champion. One thing we're going to have to do more and more over the coming months is make sure that bipartisan, make sure that what we're doing is bipartisan or nonpartisan. We're going to have to go to extraordinary ends to make sure that they're included, because there is a very good chance, as I said earlier, that they may be controlling the process. What can you do? The best thing, as I sort of suggested earlier, that local strength, that local power. You know, if you have Republican X from Arizona, to the extent that we can get as many constituents as we can, you know, either from the district or at least from the state, that is enormously helpful, right? I would say the same thing as well about if they're on the Senate side. If they're, you know, not just that district, obviously, it's the entire state. Let's use that to our advantage. And the last thing I'd say is, let's just use Jack Bergman as an example from Michigan. What we have done very effectively in the past is say, okay, Jack Bergman's on. Let's go to the rest of the Michigan delegation who are Republicans, and let's pick them off one by one. And let's say what it is and share with them that Bergman is on, that he has a personal story to tell, and that he wants support from the rest of his delegation. That's been enormously effective. And the last thing to say, and we've seen some of it during long COVID, as senators have been affected, some have shared that publicly. I think where we know there and learn about there being personal stories in the lives of these members of Congress, I think that too will have a very powerful effect. And without question, this horrible situation and condition is affecting folks, you know, regardless of party, right? And we know the stories are out there. We have to be good detectives as we go forward on this. And I think we have to be creative and innovative about how to get to those members of Congress. But again, your stories, as Emily said before, are the absolute best, provide the best ability to really educate and influence these members of Congress.
Thank you so much. And here, I think we have a lot of work to do ahead of us, but we've done so much, and there's light at the end of this tunnel, because we really have come together as such a broad chronic illness community to address these combined issues. So Stuart, thanks again for your time, for your generous insight. It's been so much fun working with you these past 4 years, and I'm sure we'll have many more. Sarah and Cynthia, thank you once again for being our Advocacy Cafe Chat panelists. We're so lucky to have your insights and expertise. That'll wrap up the recorded portion of our program. So for all of you watching at home, have a wonderful day.